When I was 62 years old, my only son sold my house right out from under me and moved 2 states away. He and his wife left me exactly $150 on a bare kitchen island, along with a sticky note that simply said, "We will figure it out." 15 years later, my grandson searched my name for a college paper. He called his parents, crying. Within 12 hours, my private phone had 200 missed calls. My name is Harrison Caldwell, 77 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful structural engineer, I eventually escaped their toxicity, but for a long time I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The vibrating sound of my phone against the solid oak of my desk was the only noise in the room. I sat in my private office in Bozeman, Montana, watching the screen light up over and over again. It was an unlisted number, a highly secure line that only a handful of corporate attorneys and executive board members possessed. Yet here it was buzzing relentlessly with an Arizona area code. I picked up the device and looked at the notifications. 200 missed calls, 47 text messages. They were frantic, desperate words flashing across the glass. "Dad, please pick up the phone." "Harrison, we are so sorry. Please let us explain." "Grandpa, it is Leo. Please call my mom back. She will not stop crying." I did not feel a spike in my heart rate. I did not feel a sudden rush of adrenaline or the burning sting of old anger. After 15 years of waiting for this exact moment, all I felt was a profound, chilling calm. I set the phone down, opened the bottom drawer of my desk, and pulled out a small, clear plastic sleeve. Inside the sleeve was a yellowed sticky note with faded ink alongside a crisp $100 bill and a worn $50 bill. "You will figure it out." The handwriting belonged to my daughter-in-law, Megan. I stared at her arrogant, hasty letters for a long time. Then I glanced at the glowing screen of my tablet. A major financial magazine had just published an exclusive feature story that morning. The headline read, "Harrison Caldwell, the ghost billionaire behind the world's leading seismic structural technology." There was a rare, candid photograph of me taken at a charity gala I had attended months ago. For a decade and a half, I had been an invisible titan in the engineering world, building a massive empire from the shadows, entirely isolated from my past. But my grandson Leo, who was now a 20-year-old engineering student at a university down in Arizona, had been researching earthquake-resistant foundations for his senior thesis. He dug into the patent history. He found my name. He found the article. And the 15-year illusion that my son and his wife had built for themselves instantly shattered into a million pieces. They finally realized that the helpless, grieving old man they had discarded like trash was not rotting in some state-run facility. He was the man who owned the patents to the materials holding up the very buildings they walked into. They had not robbed a weak old man. They had crossed a billionaire. And the sheer terror of what that meant was currently causing my phone to vibrate off the desk. To understand how I arrived at this moment of absolute clarity, you have to understand the depth of this darkness I was pushed into. You have to go back 15 years to the year 2011. We lived in an affluent suburb of Seattle, Washington. I was 62 and my entire universe had just collapsed. My wife Sarah had passed away after a long, grueling battle with illness. For nearly 40 years, Sarah was the bright, beating heart of our household. She was my anchor in a world that often felt too loud and too fast. I spent my days designing structural systems, calculating load, bearing walls, but Sarah was the foundation that kept me standing. When she took her last breath, the foundation crumbled. I was emotionally shattered. For years, leading up to her diagnosis, my life had been split between two distinct worlds, the bustling, high-stakes commercial construction sites by day and my heavily fortified basement workshop by night. It was in that dim-lit, concrete-walled sanctuary that the true legacy of Harrison Caldwell was born. Back in 2008, driven by an obsessive desire to conquer the unpredictable violence of nature, I had begun experimenting with complex chemical polymers. I wanted to create a synthetic resin that could be injected directly into commercial concrete, a substance that would allow rigid structures to flex, bend, and absorb the catastrophic kinetic energy of a massive earthquake without snapping. Sarah was the only person on Earth who knew about my relentless late-night experiments. She would often come down the wooden stairs at 2 in the morning, wrapped in her thick woolen robe carrying 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea. She would sit quietly on a stool watching me mix volatile compounds and run aggressive stress test simulations on miniature concrete pillars. She never understood the complex mathematics scribbled across my massive whiteboards, but she believed in my genius with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. When I finally cracked the formula, when I finally watched a treated concrete cylinder absorb a simulated 9.0 magnitude shockwave without a single microscopic fracture, she was the first person I hugged. We celebrated that night with cheap champagne, entirely unaware of the billions of dollars that formula would eventually generate. But the cruelest, most agonizing irony of my entire existence was that all my brilliance, all my obsessive understanding of structural integrity was completely useless when it came to saving her. I had successfully figured out how to stop towering skyscrapers from collapsing under the wrath of the earth. But I could not stop the aggressive cancer cells from systematically dismantling the woman I loved. As her illness progressed, the house transformed from a sanctuary of joy into a quiet, sterile hospice. I spent my days administering medication, tracking her failing vital signs, and watching the vibrant light slowly fade from her beautiful eyes. The grief did not hit me all at once. It seeped into my bones like freezing water, paralyzing my intellect and numbing my defenses. I stopped going into my workshop. I stopped answering calls from old colleagues. I existed in a suffocating fog of grief, wandering through a house that suddenly felt agonizingly empty. Every corner of that expensive suburban home held a memory I could barely stand to look at. The kitchen, where she used to bake on Sunday mornings, was silent. The garden she loved so much began to wilt. I was completely vulnerable, operating on autopilot, barely remembering to eat or sleep. And that is exactly when my son Derek and his wife Megan initiated their invasion. They did not call to ask if I needed space. They did not sit down with me to discuss a temporary arrangement. They simply arrived one Tuesday afternoon, the trunks of their cars, packed with heavy suitcases, boxes, and their 5-year-old son, Leo. Derek walked through the front door looking everywhere except directly at my face. He mumbled something vague about keeping me company during a hard time, but it was Megan who immediately took control of the narrative. Megan was the kind of woman who always needed to project an image of absolute perfection, a meticulously crafted facade of upper-class success, even though I knew they were constantly swimming in credit card debt. The moment she stepped into my foyer, she wrapped her arms around me in a tight embrace that felt entirely hollow. She looked at me with wide, sympathetic eyes and told me they were there to take care of me in my old age. She insisted that I should not have to be alone in such a vast, empty house with only my sad memories for company. Then she gently pushed little Leo forward. My grandson was an innocent, bright-eyed boy who did not understand the heavy atmosphere of the house. He ran up and hugged my legs. Using the boy as an emotional anchor was a calculated move on Megan's part. Seeing Leo's small smile pierced through the thick layer of my depression. How could I say no to my own grandson? How could I turn away my only child when they claimed they only wanted to help a grieving old man? I let my guard down completely. I allowed myself to lean on them, desperate for the family I had just lost. For the first few weeks, the illusion was flawless. Megan played the role of the devoted daughter-in-law to absolute perfection. She took over the household chores with aggressive efficiency. She began cooking Sarah's favorite recipes, filling the kitchen with familiar scents that weaponized my own nostalgia against me. She would bring me hot tea in the evenings, sit beside my armchair, and listen to me talk about the early days of my marriage. She created an environment where I felt entirely dependent on her daily care. Meanwhile, Derek remained in the background. My son had always been a weak man, easily swayed by shiny things and dominated by a stronger personality. He liked wealth, but despised the hard work required to build it. Around the house, he was nothing more than a ghost, leaving early and returning late, always avoiding any deep conversations with me. I chalked his distant behavior up to his own grief over losing his mother, completely blind to the real reason he refused to meet my gaze. Once Megan had successfully lowered my defenses and established herself as the indispensable manager of my daily life, she began to implement the next phase of her strategy. It started very subtly. I would find her organizing the mail on the kitchen counter, separating my bills and bank statements into neat little piles. Then she started cleaning out the filing cabinets in my home office, claiming she was just trying to declutter the space so I would not feel overwhelmed. Conversations at the dinner table gradually shifted. Instead of talking about Leo's day at school, Megan began steering topics toward the economy, the volatile housing market, and new inheritance laws. She would express deep theatrical concern about the future. She planted seeds of anxiety, mentioning how the government was mercilessly taxing grieving families and how easy it was for the state to seize assets if proper legal protections were not strictly in place. The psychological pressure began to mount with a terrifying subtlety. Megan had spent the entire morning in the kitchen, deliberately recreating the exact aroma of Sarah's famous roasted chicken and rosemary potatoes. The scent wafted through the quiet hallways of the Seattle house, wrapping around me like a warm, familiar blanket. It was a calculated weaponization of my own nostalgia, designed to soften my heart and blur my judgment. I sat at the dining table, watching her move around the kitchen with an efficiency that felt almost entirely rehearsed. Derek sat across from me, intensely focused on absolutely anything else. My only son kept his eyes glued to the polished hardwood floor, rhythmically tapping his fingers against his coffee mug. I should have recognized that subtle sign of profound cowardice right then and there. A man who believes in his own actions does not hide his gaze from his father. But my vision was clouded by the heavy, suffocating fog of recent grief. I was so utterly desperate to feel a sense of family again that I completely ignored the glaring red flags waving silently right in front of me. Megan placed a plate of the roasted chicken down gently. She smiled warmly, placing a soft hand on my shoulder. "Dad, you really need to eat something substantial today," she murmured, her voice laced with that sickeningly sweet counterfeit concern. "You have been looking so incredibly exhausted lately. We just want to make sure you are fully protected. Derek and I have been talking for weeks, and we truly believe that getting this paperwork completely finalized today is the absolute best way to secure your entire future." I nodded slowly, feeling the immense exhaustion pressing down. The sheer weight of my sadness made it incredibly difficult to argue with her. I took a small bite of the food, the familiar taste bringing a fresh wave of stinging tears to my eyes. Megan saw my emotional vulnerability and immediately capitalized on it. She smoothly pulled a thick stack of printed legal documents from a nearby folder and slid them gently across the table toward me. "These are the final forms we discussed last night, Dad," she said softly. "The state tax laws are changing very rapidly, and we absolutely must protect this property now." Before I could even attempt to read the first dense paragraph of the complex legal jargon completely, the doorbell suddenly rang. Megan swiftly walked to the front door and returned moments later, accompanied by a slick, sharply dressed man carrying a heavy leather briefcase. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and possessed the rapid, practiced smile of a man who dealt exclusively in aggressive corporate transactions. "Mr. Caldwell," the man said, extending a firm, overly enthusiastic hand. "I am a licensed public notary. Your wonderful daughter-in-law requested that I come directly to your home for your ultimate convenience today." The notary did not pause to allow me a single moment of quiet reflection at all. He immediately began pulling customized pens from his pocket and organizing the dense stacks of paper into neat, intimidating piles right next to my half-eaten plate of food. He spoke with a rapid, hypnotic cadence, deliberately glossing over the massive implications of the documents. "These are just standard asset protection forms, sir," he claimed, smoothly tapping his expensive pen against the thick signature lines. "A comprehensive power of attorney to allow your dedicated family to handle the complicated, bureaucratic nonsense while you properly grieve." I looked over at Derek one final agonizing time, silently begging him for some help. My son simply stared out the kitchen window, his jaw clenched tight, completely refusing to intervene or validate my hesitant concerns. The profound silence from my own flesh and blood felt like a heavy stone pressing down firmly on my chest. I was incredibly tired. I missed Sarah with an agonizing intensity that made breathing feel like a monumental chore. I truly believed that a father should always be able to trust his own children when he is at his absolutely weakest point. I picked up the heavy black pen the notary had aggressively pushed into my trembling, aged hand. I did not read the dense clauses outlining the absolute surrender of my financial autonomy. I did not see the specific paragraphs that legally granted Megan and Derek the unchecked authority to completely liquidate my assets, empty my bank accounts, and sell the very house I had painstakingly built with my own hands. Blinded by a desperate, foolish trust, I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name on the first dotted line. The notary quickly flipped to the next complicated page. I signed again, and again. I systematically signed away my independence, my complete security, and everything. I surrendered my entire life as I knew it, completely unaware that I was handing a loaded weapon directly to my executioners. The notary gathered the documents with practiced speed, stamped them forcefully with his official seal, and slipped them back into his dark leather briefcase. He shook my hand once more, offered a generic platitude about my recent loss, and walked out the front door. The second the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, the atmosphere inside my home shifted with a terrifying absolute finality. The immediate transformation was so drastic and profoundly chilling that it felt unreal. It felt as though the temperature in the room had plummeted 10 degrees. The sickeningly sweet smile completely vanished from Megan's face, replaced by a cold, victorious smirk that made my stomach churn violently. She did not offer me another cup of tea. She did not ask if I had finished eating my meal. Without uttering a single word to me, she unceremoniously grabbed my plate of food, scraped the remaining contents directly into the garbage disposal, and tossed the plate roughly into the stainless steel sink with a loud, aggressive clatter. I sat there in stunned, absolute silence forever. I watched the woman who had just moments ago been playing the role of a devoted caretaker suddenly transform into a completely different entity. Derek finally stood up from the table, let out a long, heavy sigh of relief, and walked straight past me without making any eye contact whatsoever. "I am going upstairs to watch television," he announced flatly to his wife, treating me as if I were nothing more than a piece of invisible furniture. Megan wiped down the kitchen counters aggressively, completely ignoring my confused, lingering presence in the room. Over the next few days, reality shattered. The monumental mistake became agonizingly clear. Megan completely stopped cooking those warm, familiar meals. The comforting scents of rosemary and baked chicken were permanently replaced by the sterile chemical smell of harsh cleaning products as she aggressively scrubbed away every lingering trace of Sarah from the house. When I tried to initiate a simple conversation in the living room, Megan would audibly sigh, roll her eyes with obvious irritation, and leave the room entirely. I was no longer a grieving father seeking comfort. I was now just a pathetic, powerless nuisance trapped in my own stolen home with cruel strangers. I needed to get out of that house just to breathe. It was a crisp Thursday morning about a week after the slick notary had walked out with my signature. Megan had stopped buying the groceries I liked. The refrigerator was suddenly filled with expensive organic brands I did not recognize and imported wines I did not drink. When I asked her if she could pick up some simple coffee grounds and basic oatmeal, she sighed loudly, grabbed her keys, and told me she simply did not have the time to cater to my specific dietary whims. I decided I would just walk down to the local market myself. I still had my pride. I grabbed my old leather wallet and walked the 6 blocks to the community bank branch where Sarah and I had done our business for over 30 years. I intended to withdraw a few $100s from my primary retirement savings account to cover my own expenses. The bell above the bank door chimed a familiar, comforting sound as I stepped inside. A young teller named Susan, who had known my wife and me for a very long time, smiled brightly when she saw me approaching her window. I handed her my withdrawal slip and my debit card asking for $300 in cash. I watched her type the numbers into her computer. Her cheerful smile slowly faded. Her fingers stopped moving over the keyboard. She frowned, clicked the mouse a few more times, and then looked up at me with an expression of profound, uncomfortable pity. "Mr. Caldwell," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am so sorry, but I cannot process this withdrawal for you today." I asked her if there was a glitch in the system. She shook her head slowly, looking around the bank lobby as if she were afraid someone might overhear our conversation. "No, sir, there is no glitch," she explained with a heartbreaking gentleness. "Your primary retirement account has a current available balance of exactly $0.00." I stood there staring at the thick safety glass separating us. The air in my lungs felt suddenly heavy and thick. I asked her to check the numbers again. I explained that I had over $400,000 securely resting in that specific savings account just a week ago. Susan turned her monitor slightly so I could see the glaring red zeros on the screen. She told me that a massive wire transfer had been initiated 2 days prior by an authorized secondary user on the account. The entire balance had been completely drained. The authorized user was my daughter-in-law. My knees went weak. I thanked Susan blindly, took my empty wallet, and walked out of the bank feeling like the ground beneath my feet had turned to ash. The walk back to my house felt like marching toward a battlefield without any armor. The cold Seattle wind bit through my thin jacket, but the chill spreading through my veins was far worse. I opened the front door to find Megan sitting comfortably at the large kitchen island. She was casually sipping an expensive espresso and scrolling through a digital catalog of high-end patio furniture on her shiny new laptop. She did not even bother to look up when I walked in. I stood at the edge of the kitchen struggling to keep my breathing steady and my hands from shaking. I asked her directly what had happened to my retirement savings. I asked her why my bank account was completely empty. Megan did not flinch. She did not show a single ounce of panic, guilt, or surprise. She slowly took another sip of her espresso, placed the porcelain cup down on a marble coaster, and finally met my gaze with a perfectly practiced look of mild annoyance. "I moved it into a high-yield mutual fund, Dad," she said smoothly, her voice completely devoid of any real emotion. "The market is incredibly volatile right now. We cannot just leave hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in a basic savings account, losing absolute value to inflation. It is simply bad financial management." I asked her why she did not consult me before moving my entire life savings. I reminded her that it was my money that Sarah and I had saved dollar by dollar for over 4 decades. Megan let out a patronizing little sigh, the kind a frustrated parent gives to a stubborn, confused toddler. "Dad," she said, leaning forward and crossing her arms over the granite countertop. "We already had this exact conversation. You signed the power of attorney specifically so Derek and I could handle these difficult, complex financial maneuvers for you. You are grieving. You are clearly not in the right state of mind to monitor shifting interest rates and mutual fund portfolios. We are doing this to protect your future. Let me handle the complex banking. You just rest and let us do the work." Her lie was delivered with terrifying sociopathic perfection. It was a plausible, logical excuse designed specifically to make me question my own memory and competence. She was using my immense grief as a weapon to gaslight me into absolute submission. I knew nothing about high-yield mutual funds. I knew about load-bearing walls and structural integrity. She knew that, and she exploited my ignorance flawlessly. I stared at her cold, unblinking eyes, realizing for the first time that I was living under the same roof as a highly functioning predator. Before I could formulate a response to her blatant manipulation, my 5-year-old grandson came running into the kitchen. Little Leo was holding a brightly colored plastic toy truck, his face lit up with innocent, untainted joy. He crashed the toy truck into my leg, making a loud engine noise, completely unaware of the tense, toxic atmosphere suffocating the room. I reached down and patted his head, forcing a weak smile to shield him from the ugly reality of his parents. Grandpa Leo said, looking up at me with those wide, honest eyes, "Why are you moving to the sad house?" The kitchen went dead silent. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator. I looked down at the boy, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. I asked him what he meant by the sad house. Leo innocently pointed his small finger toward the hallway. "Mom said, you are going to live in the sad house with the other old people who smell like medicine," he stated plainly, repeating the words with the flawless memory of a child. "Mom said, we are going to a big house with a swimming pool where it is always sunny." The color instantly drained from Megan's face. The cool, calculated mask of the perfect financial manager slipped completely. She violently snatched the boy away from my leg, gripping his small arm so hard he let out a startled whimper. She dragged him aggressively toward the staircase, her voice high-pitched and trembling with sudden, uncontained panic. High as just confusing real life with a television show he watched this morning. She did not look back as she hurried up the wooden stairs, pulling a crying Leo behind her. I stood completely frozen in the center of my own kitchen. The quiet hum of the refrigerator felt deafening against the ringing in my ears. I did not follow her. I did not shout or demand a better explanation. An older, weaker man might have confronted her right then, blinded by righteous indignation and hurt pride. The heavy fog of grief that had clouded my judgment for weeks began to lift, replaced by a cold, methodical clarity. I walked quietly to the bathroom upstairs and opened the medicine cabinet. I took the strong sleeping pills my doctor had prescribed after Sarah died, the ones Megan reminded me to take every night, and I flushed them down the toilet. I needed my mind to be sharp. I needed to stay completely awake. For the next several days, I played my part to absolute perfection. I shuffled around the house with my shoulders slumped, acting like the defeated, confused widower they desperately needed me to be. I ate the terrible food Megan prepared without complaint. I let her speak to me like a child, nodding vacantly at her endless lies about the volatile financial markets. But the moment the lights went out and their bedroom door clicked shut, my real work began. I moved through the silent house like a ghost. I checked the caller identification history on the landline phone. I noted the strange unlisted numbers. But my greatest discovery happened on a rainy Thursday night. I crept out to the side yard and carefully opened the heavy black trash bins they had rolled out for the morning collection. I dug past the food waste and the empty wine bottles until my hands brushed against torn, glossy paper. I pulled the pieces out and brought them inside, laying them flat on the dining room table under the dim glow of my small flashlight. They were ripped pages from high-end luxury real estate brochures. The properties were absolutely massive, featuring sprawling infinity pools, private tennis courts, and marble courtyards. And they were not located anywhere near Seattle. They were listings for multi-million-dollar estates nestled in the exclusive desert communities of Scottsdale, Arizona. I stared at the glossy pages, the pieces of the puzzle suddenly snapping together with terrifying precision. They had drained my retirement accounts. They tricked me into signing a comprehensive power of attorney. They added their names to the deed of my fully paid-off house. They were not managing my assets. They were systematically liquidating my entire life to fund a superficial fantasy 2 states away. The sheer scale of their betrayal was almost too massive to immediately process. I sat in the dark for hours, staring at those torn brochures, feeling a profound, agonizing sorrow for the son I had raised from a boy into a man. How had Derek become an individual so utterly devoid of a moral compass? How could he stand by silently while his cruel wife orchestrated the complete destruction of his grieving, vulnerable father? I needed absolute verbal confirmation of their wicked intentions. I needed to hear their exact timeline straight from their own mouths. The perfect opportunity finally presented itself 2 nights later. It was well past midnight. The house was completely silent, wrapped entirely in the heavy, chilling stillness of a deep Seattle slumber. I was lying wide awake in the dark shadows when I heard the faint, muffled sound of footsteps moving cautiously down the stairs. I quietly slipped out of bed, leaving my shoes behind. Walking barefoot, to prevent the old floorboards from creaking, I slowly made my way toward the staircase. I pressed my back tightly against the cool plaster of the long hallway wall, remaining completely hidden in the thick shadows. From my concealed, silent position, I had a perfectly clear line of sight directly into the dimly lit kitchen. Megan and Derek were sitting nervously at the kitchen island, illuminated only by the harsh, unnatural blue glow of an open laptop screen. I held my breath, listening intently to the hushed, urgent whispers echoing off the cold granite countertops. The Seattle house sale officially closes on Monday morning. Megan said, her voice vibrating with a greedy, uncontained excitement. The broker confirmed everything today. The exact second the buyers wire the massive funds into the joint account, we take the cash, initiate a secure transfer directly into our private Scottsdale account, and we are permanently gone. We will be on a first-class flight to Arizona by Tuesday afternoon. I watched my son run a trembling hand nervously through his thinning hair. His face looked incredibly drawn and pale under the harsh laptop light. He took a slow, anxious sip from a glass of water before he finally spoke. "What about Dad?" he asked, his voice shaking with a pathetic, cowardly hesitation. "We cannot simply leave him here with absolutely nothing. What is he realistically going to do when he finally realizes the entire house is legally sold and his money is completely gone? We cannot just abandon him on the streets." Megan slowly closed the laptop, letting out a sharp, cruel breath that sounded exactly like a physical strike. She looked at her husband with an expression of pure disgust. "Are you seriously getting weak on me right now?" she sneered, her voice dropping to a vicious, venomous hiss. "He is 62 years old. I is perfectly capable of catching a city bus to a local homeless shelter to survive. We have the ironclad power of attorney. He surrendered his entire financial autonomy completely voluntarily. He is completely legally powerless to stop any of this from happening." I felt a cold, paralyzing sensation wash violently over my entire body. I was not shocked by her breathtaking sociopathic cruelty. I was truly shocked by how incredibly easily my own son accepted it. Derek did not argue with her. He did not passionately defend the loving father who had worked his entire life to provide everything for him. He simply lowered his head, staring silently at the kitchen counter, quietly accepting his cowardly role as a willing accomplice to my complete and total destruction. I walked back up the wooden staircase with a silence that belonged to a ghost. My bare feet made absolutely no sound against the thick carpet, completely masking my retreat to the darkness of my bedroom. When I closed the heavy door behind me, the lock clicked shut with a sharp metallic finality. It was a sound that echoed the profound shift occurring deep within my own mind. I did not collapse onto the edge of the mattress. I did not bury my face in my hands. I did not shed a single, pathetic tear for the son I had irrevocably lost. That version of me, the soft, grieving father who desperately clung to the illusion of a loving family, had died the moment I overheard their venomous plan in the kitchen. In his place, a much older, colder entity took complete control. I was a structural engineer. For over 4 decades, I had made my living understanding exactly how massive things break. I spent my entire career analyzing load-bearing walls, calculating the precise breaking point of steel beams, and identifying the microscopic stress fractures that inevitably lead to catastrophic failure. My brain was systematically trained to look at a towering skyscraper and instantly pinpoint its weakest foundational joint. As I stood in the pitch-black shadows of my bedroom, I applied that exact same clinical methodology to my own life. Megan and Derek believed they had expertly engineered my total destruction. They believed they had meticulously removed every single load-bearing pillar of my financial security by tricking me into signing that comprehensive power of attorney. They assumed that because I was old and mourning my wife, my cognitive structure had completely eroded. They looked at me and saw nothing but a collapsing, fragile ruin waiting for a wrecking ball, but they had fundamentally miscalculated the core strength of the materials they were dealing with. I walked over to the large window overlooking the quiet, rain-soaked suburban street. I watched the streetlights reflect off the wet pavement, my breathing slow and incredibly steady. I was not angry. Anger is a wildly unpredictable emotion that clouds rational judgment and leads to sloppy, impulsive mistakes. I felt an absolute terrifying calm. I was going to let them believe their malicious blueprint was absolutely flawless. I would allow them to continue feeling victorious while I quietly designed a trap so structurally perfect that they would never see the walls caving in until the roof was already crushing them. The very next morning, I woke up before the sun had even crested over the dense Seattle skyline. I slipped out of the house unnoticed, leaving my regular cell phone sitting deliberately on the kitchen counter to avoid arousing any suspicion. I walked 2 miles through the biting morning cold to a deserted public park, carrying a cheap, disposable, prepaid phone I had purchased in cash days earlier. I sat heavily on a damp wooden bench beneath a sprawling willow tree and punched in a highly secure number I had committed to memory. I was calling Richard Gallagher, a ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney based out of Bozeman, Montana. Richard was a man who possessed a mind like a steel trap and an aggressive moral flexibility that made him a terrifying opponent. I quickly detailed the entire situation to him. I explained the fraudulently drained bank accounts, the manipulated power of attorney I had foolishly signed, and the hushed, venomous conversation I had overheard in the kitchen regarding their impending flight to Scottsdale. Richard listened in absolute silence. When I finally finished outlining the sheer scale of their betrayal, Richard let out a low, dark chuckle that vibrated through the cheap plastic speaker of the disposable phone. "They think they have you completely cornered, Harrison," he said, his voice dropping into a serious, calculating tone. "With that comprehensive power of attorney, they legally possess the absolute right to finalize the sale of your primary residence and drain every remaining drop of your personal liquid assets. This is a highly hostile situation. We need to act immediately. I can draft an aggressive emergency injunction right now. I have trusted judges in my network who will eagerly sign a binding restraining order before the municipal banks even close today. We can definitively freeze the escrow account, immediately halt the pending real estate transaction, and legally block your son from moving a single cent across state lines. We can stop them dead in their tracks and tie them up in brutal litigation for the next decade." I gripped the phone tightly. I stared out at the empty park, watching a solitary crow pick at the frozen grass. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the crisp winter air completely fill my aching lungs. "No, Richard," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and utterly devoid of any lingering familial warmth. "I do not want you to file an injunction. I do not want you to freeze the escrow account. I want them to steal the house. I want them to take every single dollar from that fraudulent sale and wire it directly to their private account in Arizona." There was a sharp, dramatic intake of breath on the other end of the line. Richard was a man who rarely experienced genuine confusion, but my explicit instruction clearly caught him entirely off guard. "Harrison, that is completely illogical," he countered, his professional composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "You are voluntarily letting them walk away with a massive sum of stolen money. You are literally letting them win." Why on earth would you hand them the keys? Because, Richard, I replied, a small, dark smile touching the corners of my mouth for the first time in months. That house is not a pristine suburban mansion. That house is a catastrophic financial time bomb, and I need them to be the ones tightly holding it when the timer finally reaches 0. I then began to explain the deeply buried truth about the Seattle property, a devastating truth I had kept completely hidden even from my own wife during her final years. The structure of the house itself was perfectly sound, but the land it sat on was entirely cursed. Several years ago, I had hired an independent geological surveying firm to discreetly assess the back half of the property for a potential garden expansion. The confidential survey uncovered a terrifying reality. The entire wealthy neighborhood had been unknowingly built directly over an old, undocumented commercial dumping site. The soil deep beneath those pristine, manicured lawns was highly contaminated with incredibly toxic industrial runoff. The city municipal government had very recently become aware of this massive environmental hazard. They were quietly building a monumental aggressive zoning lawsuit that would fundamentally destroy the property values across the entire residential district. Furthermore, the city was preparing to issue retroactive environmental cleanup tax liens to every single current property owner. These impending financial penalties were going to be absolutely astronomical, easily exceeding the total market value of the homes themselves. The only reason this impending disaster had not yet tanked the active sale of my house was simply because the city's complex legal filings had not yet officially hit the public registry. It was a temporary bureaucratic delay, a brief fragile window of silence before a devastating legal storm. If I were to personally sell that house right now, I explained to Richard, my voice dropping to a methodical whisper, I would be legally obligated to fully disclose the terrifying results of that private geological survey to the unsuspecting new buyers. If I intentionally hid that crucial information, I would be committing massive, undeniable real estate fraud. When the city inevitably files their toxic zoning lawsuits and drops those crushing environmental tax liens, the furious buyers would immediately sue me into absolute oblivion. I would spend the rest of my natural life drowning in brutal, inescapable litigation. Richard remained perfectly quiet, the sheer brilliance of the toxic trap finally dawning on him. But I am not the one selling the house today, Richard, I continued, letting the cold reality of my strategy fully sink in. Megan and Derek deliberately forced me to sign a comprehensive power of attorney. They eagerly established themselves as the sole authorized signatories for this massive real estate transaction. They are the ones aggressively pushing this sale through escrow. They are the ones blindly signing the final disclosure forms under the absolute penalty of perjury. By eagerly using that legal document to steal my home, they are legally assuming all of the impending liabilities. They are officially taking full ownership of a catastrophic environmental nightmare. I am meticulously isolating myself from the entire fallout. When the toxic dust finally settles, their stolen paradise will burn to the ground, and we will be safely watching from a distance as their greed destroys them completely. Richard let out a long, slow breath of pure professional admiration. That is a flawlessly vindictive legal snare, Harrison, he murmured softly. You walk away with your hands perfectly clean, and they happily lock themselves inside a burning building. I told him to prepare the secondary phase of our plan immediately. I instructed him to activate the anonymous corporate trust holding the exclusive rights to my earthquake-resistant polymer. I calmly hung up the small disposable phone and violently shattered it into tiny pieces against the hard, frozen concrete edge of the public park bench. I tossed the broken pieces into a rusted trash bin and began the long walk back to my stolen house. I was absolutely ready to let them think they had permanently won this vicious, one-sided war. The weekend passed with an agonizingly slow rhythm. I spent those final 2 days drifting through the hallways of my home, committing every single detail to memory. I knew this would be the absolute last time I would ever set foot inside these walls. Megan and Derek were buzzing with a frenetic, nervous energy. They were constantly whispering in the corners of the rooms, abruptly silencing their conversations the very second I walked past. They were frantically packing small boxes, claiming they were just doing some deep spring cleaning to help organize the estate. I simply nodded, maintaining my carefully constructed facade of a confused, grieving widower. I did not ask questions. I just let them continue building their own gallows. Monday morning finally arrived, bringing with it a thick, heavy layer of gray Seattle clouds that threatened a torrential downpour. I came down the stairs wearing my heavy wool coat and my old leather driving gloves. Megan was standing in the kitchen, aggressively scrubbing a perfectly clean countertop. She looked up, her eyes darting nervously toward the front window, where a massive moving truck was scheduled to arrive the moment I left the premises. I told her in a soft, trembling voice that I needed to spend the entire day at the cemetery. I told her I missed Sarah terribly and needed to sit by her grave to find some peace. Megan immediately manufactured a look of deep, pathetic sympathy. She walked over and patted my arm, her touch feeling like cold ice against my jacket. "Take all the time you need, Dad," she murmured smoothly. "It is incredibly important to grieve properly. Derek and I will stay right here and hold down the fort. You just focus on Mom today. Do not worry about a single thing here." I looked over her shoulder and saw Derek standing near the back door clutching a roll of packing tape. He refused to look at me. I gave them both a slow, definitive nod, turned around, and walked out the front door for the very last time. I actually did drive to the cemetery. I parked my old sedan near the wrought iron gates and walked the familiar paved path to where my beautiful wife rested. The rain began to fall in a slow, steady drizzle, soaking into my coat, but I did not seek any shelter. I stood before Sarah's polished headstone and spoke to her in the quiet isolation of the graveyard. I told her everything. I apologized for not seeing the profound darkness growing inside the son we had raised together. I promised her that I would not let them completely destroy the legacy we had built with our own two hands. I stood there for hours, letting the freezing rain wash away the final lingering traces of my old, vulnerable life. I was saying goodbye to my wife, but I was also saying goodbye to the man I used to be. When the sky finally turned a deep, bruised purple, and the streetlights began to flicker on across the city, I knew it was time. I checked the dashboard clock in my car. It was exactly 6 o'clock in the evening. I put the vehicle in drive and slowly made my way back to the affluent suburban neighborhood. As I pulled my car into the long driveway, the first thing I noticed was the absolute deafening silence. There were no lights on inside the house. Derek's expensive leased vehicle was completely gone. Megan's sports utility vehicle was nowhere to be seen. The house looked like a dark, abandoned, hollow shell. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. My boots echoed loudly against the hardwood floor. The echo was incredibly sharp because there was absolutely nothing left to absorb the sound. The house was completely empty. They had not just taken their own personal belongings. They had methodically stripped the entire property bare. The expensive leather sofas I had purchased for Sarah were gone. The large antique dining table, where we had hosted countless family Thanksgiving dinners, had vanished. Even the framed family photographs that used to line the hallway walls had been ripped down, leaving behind nothing but small, faded rectangular shadows on the expensive wallpaper. They had completely erased my existence from the premises. I walked slowly through the desolate rooms, feeling the chilling draft that swept through the empty spaces. I did not feel a single pang of sorrow. I felt an overwhelming validation. Every dark suspicion I harbored had just been perfectly confirmed. I finally made my way into the large open-concept kitchen. The massive granite island, the very place where Megan had so confidently plotted my total destruction, was entirely bare except for one small, isolated spot in the exact center. I walked closer, my eyes locking onto the small arrangement they had purposefully left behind. Sitting directly on the cold stone surface was a single brightly colored sticky note. Resting neatly on top of the small yellow square of paper was a crumpled $100 bill and a similarly worn $50 bill. I stood over the kitchen island and stared down at my designated inheritance. $150. That was the exact total value my only son had placed on my life, my decades of hard work, and my absolute devotion as a father. I slowly reached out and picked up the yellow sticky note. The ink was dark and written in a hasty, arrogant scrawl. It was Megan's handwriting. The message was incredibly brief, devoid of any warmth, any apology, or any basic human decency. We had to move the note read. The money paid off our debts. You will figure it out. You will figure it out. The sheer audacity of those 5 words hung in the empty, freezing air of the stolen house. They truly believed they had left a senile, powerless old man to freeze in an empty house with a handful of pocket change. They believed I would panic. They expected me to break down, call the local authorities in tears, and eventually accept a pathetic, lonely demise in a state-funded charity ward while they lived like absolute royalty in the sunny deserts of Arizona. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear. I stood alone in the dark, empty kitchen of the toxic, legally cursed house they had just officially claimed as their own, and I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was a cold, chilling expression of absolute victory. I carefully folded the yellow sticky note, making sure not to crease the arrogant handwriting, and slipped it safely into the breast pocket of my heavy wool coat. I picked up the crumpled $100 bill and the worn $50 bill, smoothing them out flat before placing them deliberately into my leather wallet. I was going to keep these items forever. They were the physical trophies of their catastrophic greed. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out my primary cellular phone. I dialed the direct number for Richard Gallagher. He answered on the very first ring, clearly waiting by the phone for my designated signal. "Richard," I said, my voice echoing powerfully through the empty, doomed house. "The property is completely vacant. The money is gone. They took the bait." There was a moment of profound silence on the other end of the line, followed by a sharp, satisfied breath. "Are you absolutely certain?" Harrison Richard asked smoothly. "I am holding their pathetic goodbye note in my hands right now," I replied calmly. "They used the power of attorney. The sale is officially closed under their names. They are currently driving a truck full of stolen furniture toward an absolute legal slaughterhouse. Initiate Phase 2. I ended the call with Richard Gallagher and placed the disposable phone directly onto the bare granite kitchen island. I did not need it anymore. I reached deep into the heavy pocket of my wool coat and pulled out the brass keys to the front door. I set them down gently next to the phone. I wanted Megan and Derek to eventually find them when the angry city inspectors inevitably came knocking to condemn the toxic property. I turned my back on this empty kitchen and walked out the front door, pulling it shut until the deadbolt clicked very loudly. I did not look back at the suburban house I had painstakingly built with Sarah. That chapter of my existence was officially closed forever. I walked through the dark, rain-slicked streets of Seattle for nearly an hour until I reached a 24-hour commercial banking center. Before Sarah passed away, when my engineering intuition first warned me that the economy was taking a dark turn, I had discreetly established a small, heavily encrypted offshore emergency fund. It was a modest private account containing exactly $40,000, completely detached from the local credit unions Megan had aggressively plundered. I walked up to the automated teller, inserted a plain black debit card, and initiated a maximum cash withdrawal immediately. The machine whirred loudly and dispensed thick stacks of fresh $100 bills. I folded the money into a waterproof leather pouch and secured it tightly inside the inner pocket of my heavy winter coat. I was now completely off the grid. I possessed no active local bank accounts, no registered vehicles, and absolutely no property in the state of Washington. I was officially a ghost. I walked to the Greyhound bus terminal located on the edge of the city. The fluorescent lights of the station flickered overhead as I paid for a one-way ticket in cold cash. I boarded a midnight bus headed east. I sat in the very back row watching the wet, gloomy skyline of Seattle slowly fade into the absolute darkness. The journey eastward was a grueling, hypnotic blur of icy highways and flickering amber streetlights. The interior of the Greyhound bus smelled of stale coffee, damp wool, and quiet desperation. I sat with my head pressed against the freezing, vibrating glass of the window, watching the dense pine forests of Washington give way to the rugged, snow-blasted plains of the Idaho Panhandle. With every passing mile marker, I felt the heavy, suffocating skin of my former life shedding away. The vulnerable, grieving father, who had desperately craved the affection of a cowardly son, was dead, left behind in the toxic soil of Seattle. By the time the sun began to aggressively pierce through the jagged mountain peaks, a new entity had completely calcified inside my chest. I was no longer a victim. I was a calculating predator steadily marching toward his throne. When I finally arrived in Bozeman, the architectural vision for my new existence was already perfectly blueprinted in my mind. The fortress I commissioned was not merely a house. It was a physical manifestation of absolute distrust and impenetrable security. I purchased an entire mountain ridge, ensuring that my closest neighbor was miles away across impassable terrain. The structure itself was an engineering marvel, anchored deeply into the solid granite bedrock, utilizing the very same seismic polymer I had invented. The exterior was clad in dark, weather-resistant titanium panels and non-reflective bulletproof smart glass that automatically tinted to absorb the harsh alpine sunlight. It featured an entirely self-sustaining geothermal heating system, independent subterranean water reservoirs, and a massive climate-controlled bunker laboratory. The perimeter was lined with motion-tracking thermal cameras and acoustic sensors that could detect the footsteps of a stray wolf in the dead of night. I deliberately designed a kingdom where I would never, under any circumstances, be forced to rely on the unreliable, treacherous nature of another human being ever again. I rode that bus for 12 grueling hours, crossing state lines through the desolate, freezing night until we finally reached a small regional airport in Idaho. From there, I purchased a commercial flight directly into the rugged, sprawling mountains of Bozeman, Montana. When I finally stepped off the small plane, everything felt profoundly different. The freezing mountain wind hit my face like a physical blow. The air in Montana was incredibly thin, sharp, and entirely pure. It smelled of pine needles and absolute isolation. It was the exact opposite of the suffocating, toxic suburban neighborhood I had just escaped. Richard Gallagher had arranged for a private car to be waiting for me at the small regional airport. A quiet, professional driver holding a simple white placard with my initials escorted me to a sleek black sedan. We drove for nearly an hour away from the busy city center, climbing much higher into the mountains. We traveled deep into the remote, snow-capped wilderness until we reached a private, heavily secured temporary residence Richard had leased under an anonymous corporate holding company. The passage of time in the mountains is profoundly different from the frantic rhythm of the city. In Seattle, time was measured by rush hour traffic and the constant suffocating pressure of societal expectations. In Bozeman, Montana, time was measured by the changing of the seasons, the quiet accumulation of snow on the peaks, and the steady exponential growth of Caldwell engineering. The decade between 2011 and 2021 was a period of monumental transformation for me. I spent the first few years completely immersing myself in the architectural design and construction of my private estate. I purchased a sprawling, isolated tract of land that was completely inaccessible to the general public. I hired specialized contractors from out of state, paying them exorbitant premiums in exchange for ironclad non-disclosure agreements. They built a hyper-modern fortress of glass, steel, and reinforced concrete seamlessly integrated into the rugged mountain landscape. The property featured a massive state-of-the-art subterranean laboratory where I could continue my research in absolute solitude. The perimeter was secured by a highly sophisticated surveillance grid, impenetrable wrought iron gates, and a private security team composed of former military personnel. I was a man who had been cast aside to die in the cold, but I had resurrected myself as an untouchable king inside a silent, unbreachable castle. While I isolated my physical presence, my intellectual property aggressively conquered the globe. Richard Gallagher executed my corporate strategy with terrifying flawless precision. He leveraged my seismic structural polymer to completely dominate the international construction materials market. Caldwell Engineering did not manufacture the polymer directly. We exclusively controlled the chemical formula and licensed the strict manufacturing rights to the largest industrial conglomerates in Asia, Europe, and North America. Every single time a major infrastructure project in a high-risk seismic zone poured a concrete foundation, they were legally obligated to pay us a massive royalty fee. The financial returns were absolutely staggering. Billions of dollars flowed through a complex, brilliantly obscured network of international corporate trusts directly into my heavily shielded accounts. Despite this unimaginable wealth, I maintained absolute unwavering anonymity. I instituted a strict corporate policy that forbade any public photographs, any media interviews, and any direct association between my personal identity and the corporate entity. When major financial magazines attempted to profile the mysterious founder of Caldwell Engineering, they hit a solid brick wall of legal non-disclosure agreements. I became a silent titan in the industry, a ghost billionaire who pulled the strings of a global empire from the quiet shadows of a snow-covered mountain. Yet even as my empire expanded across the continents, my attention never completely drifted away from the scorching deserts of Arizona. I possessed the patience of a man who had survived absolute betrayal, and I watched my enemies with the calculated precision of a hawk circling a field of oblivious mice. Every 3 months, exactly on the first Monday of the new financial quarter, Richard Gallagher would arrive at my Montana estate. He would step out of his black vehicle carrying a thick, sealed leather briefcase and walk directly into my private study. We would sit across from each other at my large mahogany desk, drinking bitter black coffee, while the cold wind howled against the reinforced glass windows. Richard would carefully unseal the briefcase and slide a meticulously compiled dossier across the polished wood. This was the quarterly report. His elite investigative division monitored every single aspect of Derek and Megan's superficial existence in Scottsdale, tracking their movements, their financial transactions, and their inevitable spectacular descent into a desperate illusion of wealth. I would slowly open the dossier and read the detailed accounts of their pathetic artificial reality. The reports painted a crystal-clear picture of two incredibly greedy people completely consumed by their own vanity. They had taken the stolen cash from the Seattle house sale and aggressively poured it into maintaining a wildly unsustainable facade of upper-class elite status. The photographs enclosed in the files showed them standing next to exotic, high-performance sports cars that were entirely leased at predatory interest rates. I read detailed summaries of their exorbitant monthly expenditures at exclusive country clubs, high-end restaurants, and designer boutiques. Megan had completely reinvented herself as a wealthy desert socialite, hosting lavish, expensive parties around a massive swimming pool, pretending to be a woman of refined taste and generational wealth. Derek played the role of the successful businessman, wearing expensive tailored suits to a mediocre mid-level management job that barely covered the monthly maintenance fees on their sprawling, heavily mortgaged desert mansion. Reading those quarterly dossiers became a fascinating psychological study in human greed. They had absolutely no concept of genuine wealth management or long-term financial stability. They treated the money they had stolen from me as if it were an infinite magical resource. They did not invest a single dollar into anything with lasting value. They simply threw cash at their own insecurities, desperately trying to impress a superficial circle of fake friends who would gladly abandon them the moment the money ran dry. I sat in my quiet billionaire fortress and studied the complex itemized spreadsheets detailing their massive credit card debt. I saw exactly how many secondary mortgages they had secretly taken out against the Scottsdale property just to keep their pathetic illusion afloat. They were drowning in a sea of their own toxic vanity, entirely oblivious to the monumental legal tsunami that was rapidly approaching from their past in Washington state. The poetic contrast between our two diverging lives was absolutely undeniable and completely satisfying to witness from afar. I had been violently discarded from my own home, left with absolutely nothing but exactly $150 and a cruel, dismissive sticky note on a bare kitchen counter. Yet I had patiently and meticulously built a genuine, globally recognized industrial empire, firmly based on tireless hard work, brilliant scientific innovation, and absolute, unwavering discretion. They, on the other hand, had maliciously stolen an entire lifetime of carefully accumulated savings. Yet they were frantically treading water in a shallow, pathetic pool of heavily leased luxury and mounting suffocating anxiety. I never felt a single ounce of paternal pity for them when I methodically reviewed those complex financial files. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical validation of my long-term strategy. I knew that the catastrophic municipal zoning lawsuits back in Seattle were slowly creeping closer to their final devastating legal stages. I knew that the massive, crippling environmental tax liens were quietly gathering terrifying momentum in the background, preparing to strike. They arrogantly thought they had outsmarted me. They smugly believed they had successfully discarded a helpless, senile old man. But every 3 months, when I finally closed that thick leather dossier and handed it directly back across the desk to Richard, I knew the absolute truth. They were living on borrowed time. The incredibly painful expiration date was moving closer with every passing day. I just sat silently in the quiet shadows of my mountain, calmly watching their fragile world burn, and waited for the inevitable detonation. The detonation did not happen overnight. It was preceded by a masterclass in financial ruin that played out over 4 entertaining years. Through the meticulous quarterly reports Richard provided, I watched Megan and Derek systematically dismantle their stolen windfall with arrogance that bordered on profound delusion. The Seattle property sold for a substantial amount of cash, but living like newly minted desert royalty in Scottsdale requires a massive influx of capital they simply did not possess. They had no sustainable income. Derek secured an unremarkable mid-level position at a regional logistics firm, earning a salary that barely covered the exorbitant property taxes on their sprawling mansion. Megan did not work at all. Her full-time occupation consisted entirely of maintaining a meticulously curated social facade. The financial dossiers detailed their frantic efforts to keep up appearances among the genuine multimillionaires of their gated community. I read the line items showing aggressive leasing agreements for 2 European sports cars. The monthly payments on those vehicles alone rivaled the gross income of an average working family. They purchased an outrageously expensive membership to the most exclusive private country club in the county, desperately buying their way into social circles that secretly mocked their glaring desperation. Megan hosted lavish weekend brunches catered by private chefs, simultaneously opening dozens of high-interest credit card accounts to discreetly float the mounting costs. The exact moment their pathetic manufactured illusion finally shattered was a scene of absolute spectacular humiliation. Richard's investigative team managed to secure the security footage of the incident, and it was a masterpiece of social execution. It was a bright Tuesday afternoon at the incredibly exclusive Desert Ridge Country Club. Megan was hosting a lavish catered luncheon for a dozen of the wealthiest socialites in Scottsdale, aggressively flaunting her leased diamond jewelry and loudly dominating the conversation. When the discreet, tuxedo-clad waiter approached her table and presented the leather folio containing the exorbitant bill, Megan nonchalantly slipped her sleek metallic platinum credit card onto the silver tray without even glancing at the total. 5 minutes later, the club's general manager personally approached the table. His posture was stiff, his face an unreadable mask of corporate politeness. He leaned down and quietly informed Megan that her card had been aggressively declined by the issuing bank. Not just declined, flagged for severe delinquency. Assuming it was a minor banking error, a furious Megan aggressively produced a second card. Declined. A third card. Declined. The suffocating silence that descended upon the table was deafening. The wealthy women surrounding her predators in their own right instantly smelled the metaphorical blood in the water. Their fake, overly whitened smiles vanished, replaced by cold, judgmental stares. Megan was forced to excuse herself, her face burning with a fiery, uncontainable shame, and frantically begged Derek to wire funds from his depleting checking account just to cover the Caesar salads. By the time she humiliatingly marched out of the country club, the vicious gossip had already spread through the affluent community like a devastating wildfire. She was permanently exiled from their superficial social circles before her leased car even left the parking lot. 2 days later, at 4 in the morning, a massive flatbed tow truck quietly backed into their paver stone driveway and repossessed both of their expensive European sports cars. Derek watched helplessly through the drawn living room blinds, sipping cheap whiskey, completely paralyzed by his own monumental cowardice. They were treating the stolen Seattle cash as if it were an infinite spring, completely oblivious to the harsh mathematical reality that the well was rapidly running dry. By year 4 of their Grand Desert experiment, the massive pool of stolen money was all but gone. The reports showed a terrifying spike in their debt-to-income ratio. They were quietly taking out secondary loans against the inflated equity of their heavily mortgaged Scottsdale home just to pay the minimum balances on their suffocating credit cards. They were trapped in a vicious, unbreakable cycle of predatory debt, desperately trying to project an image of absolute perfection while their actual foundation was rotting from the inside out. I watched this slow motion collapse from the serene comfort of my mountain estate, feeling absolutely no sympathy for their self-inflicted misery. They built a beautiful, towering castle made entirely of wet sand, and the tide was finally coming in to wash it away. The devastating tidal wave officially struck in the early spring of 2015. Richard arrived in Montana for our scheduled quarterly meeting, but this time he was not carrying the usual brown leather briefcase. He walked into my private study, carrying a thick, bright red legal binder, a predatory smile stretching across his weathered face. The municipal government in Washington state had finally moved forward with their massive environmental zoning initiative. The dormant legal trap I had carefully designed and deliberately left behind in Seattle had violently snapped shut. The wealthy, unsuspecting family who had purchased my former home received a terrifying knock on their front door. City inspectors served them with official municipal notices informing them that their beautiful manicured backyard sat directly above a highly toxic, undocumented commercial dumping site. The property was immediately flagged for severe structural and environmental code violations. The market value of the pristine suburban mansion plummeted to absolutely nothing overnight. Furthermore, the city levied astronomical retroactive environmental cleanup liens against the property, demanding millions of dollars in mandatory remediation costs. The new owners were financially ruined, facing the complete loss of their life savings and a sudden terrifying debt they could never repay. As expected, the furious buyers immediately hired the most vicious, aggressive real estate litigation firm in the Pacific Northwest. They launched a massive, comprehensive investigation to uncover exactly who was responsible for selling them a catastrophic environmental hazard. They meticulously dug through the local county property records, pulling every document associated with the escrow process and the final transfer of the deed. They were looking for the specific individual who had signed the mandatory property disclosure forms under the strict penalty of perjury, effectively lying about the pristine condition of the contaminated land. They found exactly what I had wanted them to find. Because Megan and Derek had been so incredibly eager to steal my assets, they used the fraudulent power of attorney to completely commandeer the sale. My name was entirely absent from the final closing documents. The comprehensive legal liability rested solely and exclusively on the two individuals who had proudly signed the binding contracts. The furious buyers officially filed a massive, multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit directly against Derek and Megan Caldwell. The devastating legal charges included aggressive contract fraud, malicious failure to disclose catastrophic environmental defects, and severe financial endangerment. The buyers were not just seeking to reverse the sale. They were demanding total financial restitution, severe punitive damages, and full compensation for the impending municipal tax liens. The lawsuit landed on the front porch of their massive Scottsdale mansion like a literal bomb. Richard presented the court filings to me, detailing exactly how the process servers publicly embarrassed Megan in front of her superficial country club friends. The sheer scale of the legal action was utterly insurmountable for a couple who had already burned through their stolen cash. Because they utilized the comprehensive power of attorney to execute the sale, they were held entirely personally liable for the massive fraud. There was absolutely no corporate shield to protect them. There was no legal loophole they could exploit. I had meticulously isolated my own identity from the fallout, leaving them standing entirely alone on the tracks, with a massive freight train hurtling directly toward them. The rapid, spectacular collapse of their arrogant facade was glorious to witness. The lawsuit immediately triggered a devastating chain reaction throughout their fragile financial ecosystem. The moment the massive civil action hit the public records, their predatory creditors panicked. The banks aggressively called in the secondary loans they had taken out against the Scottsdale property. The leasing companies repossessed the expensive European sports cars directly from their paver stone driveway. Derek, whose mediocre job relied heavily on a clean corporate background check, was unceremoniously fired the moment his employers discovered he was facing a multi-million-dollar fraud investigation. They were stripped of their income, their mobility, and their precious social status all at once. They frantically attempted to hire legal defense teams in Arizona, but no reputable law firm would touch a catastrophic out-of-state environmental fraud case without a massive upfront cash retainer, a retainer they simply could not afford. The stolen money was completely gone, squandered on expensive dinners and fleeting vanity. They had absolutely nothing left to fight with. I sat quietly in my secure mountain fortress, sipping my dark coffee and reviewing the final pages of Richard's bright red binder. The toxic trap had worked with an absolutely flawless, terrifying precision. They had brutally kicked a grieving father out into the cold, expecting him to quietly perish in the shadows. Instead, they had unknowingly and unwittingly signed their own massive financial death warrants, permanently destroying their fragile lives with the exact same legal weapon they had eagerly forged to completely destroy mine forever. The years between 2021 and 2026 were an absolute masterclass in self-destruction for Derek and Megan. The massive civil lawsuit originating from the toxic Seattle property did not just bankrupt them. It completely obliterated every single facet of their superficial existence. Because they had no liquid assets remaining to hire a competent legal defense team, the furious buyers easily secured a devastating default judgment against them. The courts aggressively garnished Derek's already non-existent wages and placed impenetrable liens on their sprawling Scottsdale mansion. Desperation breeds spectacular stupidity, and my son and his wife were no exception to that rule. In a pathetic attempt to maintain their lavish lifestyle and fight the mounting legal judgments, they turned to predatory lenders. They took out incredibly dangerous high-interest title loans with unforgiving private equity firms. It was the financial equivalent of trying to extinguish a raging house fire by pouring highly flammable gasoline directly onto the flames. I sat in my quiet, hyper-modern estate in Bozeman, Montana, meticulously reviewing the quarterly dossiers that Richard Gallagher continued to provide. The updates were no longer just financial reports. They were a tragic, chronological documentation of a family completely tearing itself apart from the inside. When Derek lost his mid-level management job, he lost the final tether to his fragile masculinity. He spent his days sitting in the dark, empty rooms of a desert mansion. They could no longer afford to air condition. Drowning in a sea of insurmountable debt and profound self-pity. Megan suffered a spectacular mental collapse. Stripped of her leased European sports cars and her exclusive country club memberships, Her entire fabricated identity completely evaporated. She could no longer face the wealthy friends she had spent years desperately trying to impress. To cope with the brutal reality of her absolute failure, she descended rapidly into severe alcoholism. The investigative photographs Richard provided showed a woman who had aged 2 decades in the span of 5 years. The perfectly manicured lawn of their Arizona estate died, turning into a barren patch of dry, cracked dirt. The crystal-clear water of their massive infinity pool turned a murky, stagnant green. By the winter of 2025, the aggressive private lenders finally initiated official foreclosure proceedings. The bank prepared to forcefully evict them from the rotting shell of the mansion they had essentially stolen from me, while I watched my betrayers slowly suffocate beneath the crushing weight of their own monumental greed. My investigative focus began to shift toward the only innocent casualty in their catastrophic war. My grandson Leo was no longer the small, bright-eyed 5-year-old boy who had unknowingly exposed his mother's cruel lies in my Seattle kitchen. He had grown into a remarkably intelligent, resilient young man in his early 20s. He had spent his formative teenage years trapped inside a crumbling, toxic household, watching his parents transform into bitter, defeated shadows of their former selves. Yet despite the suffocating environment of financial ruin and emotional neglect, Leo had somehow managed to thrive academically. The detailed background checks revealed that Leo possessed a mind incredibly similar to my own. He was completely fascinated by structure mathematics and the fundamental laws of physics. He had graduated near the top of his high school class and had been accepted into a highly prestigious structural engineering program at the University of Arizona. It was a poetic, almost heartbreaking revelation. The very grandson, whose parents had maliciously stolen my entire life's work, was completely determined to follow in my exact professional footsteps. However, Leo's brilliant academic future was in severe jeopardy because of the massive, unforgiving sins of his mother and father. Because Derek and Megan were entirely bankrupt and drowning in multi-million-dollar legal judgments, they could not offer their son a single dollar of financial support. They had squandered the enormous cash windfall that should have secured his college education on leased luxury vehicles and pathetic country club parties. As a direct result of their profound selfishness, Leo was forced to take on massive, crippling federal and private student loans just to cover his basic freshman tuition. I read the reports detailing his grueling daily schedule. I was attending rigorous advanced engineering lectures during the day and working exhausting late-night shifts at a local diner just to pay for his textbooks and a modest shared apartment near the university campus. The surveillance reports detailing Leo's daily existence were a testament to his raw, unbreakable grit. While his parents spent their days hiding in a dark, foreclosed mansion, drowning their self-inflicted miseries in cheap alcohol, Leo was fighting a brutal war for his own survival. His shifts at the diner usually began at 10 o'clock at night, right after his grueling 3-hour advanced calculus seminars. He would tie a stained, grease-splattered apron around his waist and spend the next 8 hours clearing plates, scrubbing burnt coffee pots, and serving drunk college students who were carelessly blowing their parents' money. Yet even in that miserable, neon-lit diner, his brilliant mind refused to stagnate. The private investigators frequently observed him sitting in the cramped, windowless break room during his brief 15-minute respites, aggressively scribbling complex load distribution formulas and thermodynamic equations onto the back of discarded order slips. His shoes were worn through the soles, and his eyes carried the heavy dark circles of chronic sleep deprivation, but his focus was absolute. He harbored a deep, silent, and burning resentment for the mother and father who had squandered a massive fortune on absolute vanity while leaving him to scrounge for instant ramen. On the nights when the physical exhaustion felt insurmountable, Leo would pull out a worn, faded photograph he kept securely tucked inside his wallet. It was a picture taken nearly 2 decades ago in a rainy Seattle backyard. It showed a much younger, happier Harrison Caldwell kneeling in the mud, patiently teaching a tiny, bright-eyed boy how to build a structurally sound arch bridge out of wooden popsicle sticks and wood glue. that fleeting, beautiful memory of his grandfather. The only man who had ever shown him the true value of building things to last was the invisible fuel that kept Leo standing when the entire world demanded he collapse. I was carrying the heavy, unfair burden of his parents' spectacular failures squarely on his own young shoulders. I could easily watch Derek and Megan burn to the ground without feeling a single ounce of remorse, but I absolutely refused to let the fire consume my grandson's potential. I was not going to allow the Caldwell engineering legacy to simply die out because of my son's profound cowardice. It was time for the silent architect to gently intervene. I summoned Richard Gallagher to my Montana estate for a highly specific, highly confidential meeting. I instructed him to immediately establish a complex, fully blind educational trust fund routed through several anonymous philanthropic organizations. I demanded that the legal structure of this trust be absolutely ironclad and completely invisible. I did not want my name associated with it in any public capacity, and more importantly that I needed to ensure that Derek and Megan could never access, divert, or even see a single penny of the funds. The money was to be utilized strictly and exclusively for Leo's academic and living expenses. Within 3 weeks, the financial machinery was perfectly in place. The anonymous trust officially contacted the financial aid department at the University of Arizona. They quietly paid off every single cent of Leo's accumulated student loan debt in one massive, untraceable lump sum payment. Furthermore, the trust established a full, comprehensive scholarship that completely covered his ongoing tuition, his laboratory fees, his housing costs, and provided a generous monthly stipend for his basic living expenses. When the university notified Leo that a mysterious anonymous benefactor had selected his outstanding academic profile for a full-ride engineering scholarship, the boy reportedly broke down in tears of absolute relief in the financial aid office. He was finally free from the crushing, suffocating financial anxiety that his parents had selfishly forced upon him. He could quit his exhausting late-night diner job and focus entirely on mastering the complex structural sciences that ran deep within his blood. I sat in the quiet, absolute serenity of my mountain fortress, staring at a photograph of my grandson standing proudly in front of his university engineering building. I had successfully managed to completely save the boy without ever throwing a single lifeline to the drowning parents who had tried to destroy me. It was the ultimate satisfying exercise in surgical precision. I was feeding the bright, promising future of my family bloodline, while simultaneously letting the diseased, toxic branches wither and die on the vine. I was his silent guardian, a ghost watching over his progress from the distant snowy peaks of Montana, waiting very patiently for the day he would finally be ready to learn the absolute ultimate truth. It was the late spring of 2026, when the carefully maintained silence of the past 15 years finally shattered. I was 77 years old, comfortably seated in the quiet mahogany study of my Montana estate, watching the snow slowly melt off the distant mountain peaks. Hundreds of miles away in the scorching heat of an Arizona University library. The final piece of my long game was perfectly falling into place. My grandson Leo was deeply immersed in the final weeks of his senior year. He was an exceptional engineering student completely oblivious to the fact that a blind trust was quietly funding his entire academic existence. For his final senior thesis, Leo had chosen to research the complex evolution of modern seismic foundation systems. He was specifically analyzing the structural polymers used in high-risk earthquake zones across the Pacific Rim. As a brilliant, meticulous student, Leo did not just read the surface-level textbooks. He aggressively dug into the raw industrial data. He accessed the international registry to trace the exact origins of the chemical compounds that were currently dominating the global construction market. He spent hours tracing the complex corporate licensing agreements back to their absolute source. He navigated through the dense labyrinth of anonymous holding companies and international trusts that Richard Gallagher had built to shield my identity. But a patent registry is a matter of strict federal record. No matter how deeply you bury the corporate ownership, the name of the original inventor must legally remain attached to the foundational filing. Late one Tuesday evening, illuminated only by the harsh glow of his computer monitor, Leo finally uncovered the original patent document from 2010. He stared at the screen in absolute disbelief when he read the name listed as the sole creator of the multi-billion-dollar technology. Harrison Caldwell. Leo knew that his grandfather was named Harrison Caldwell, but the narrative he had been fed his entire life was a pathetic tragedy. Megan and Derek had told him that I was a broken, incompetent old man who had aimlessly wandered away after his grandmother died, likely perishing in some forgotten, underfunded state facility. They had painted me as a helpless victim of my own deteriorating mind to completely justify their brutal abandonment. Seeing my exact name attached to the most lucrative structural patent of the 21st century created a profound cognitive dissonance in my grandson. Thinking it must be a bizarre coincidence, Leo immediately opened a new search window. He typed my full name into the search engine. For 15 years, that search would have yielded absolutely nothing. But destiny has a brilliant sense of dramatic timing. Just 4 hours prior to Leo's search, a major financial magazine had officially published an exclusive, incredibly detailed, investigative feature. The bold headline flashed across his screen. Harrison Caldwell, the ghost billionaire behind the world's leading seismic structural technology. The article detailed my massive hidden empire, the staggering wealth generated by Caldwell Engineering, and my absolute refusal to engage with the public. But the most devastating piece of evidence was not the text. It was a photograph. An aggressive investigative journalist had managed to snap a rare candid picture of me leaving a private charity gala in Bozeman just a few months prior. I had aged significantly, my hair was completely white, and my face bore the deep, weathered lines of a man who had lived through profound betrayal. But the eyes were exactly the same. Leo stared at the high-resolution image of the impeccably dressed billionaire. He recognized the distinct shape of my jaw and the cold, unyielding stare. It was the exact same man who used to bounce him on his knee in the quiet suburbs of Seattle. The shock hit the boy with the force of a physical blow. He did not hesitate. He did not wait for the morning. Armed with a printed copy of the financial article and the stark patent records, Leo drove his beat-up sedan directly to the rotting foreclosed mansion where his parents were currently squatting. He walked through the unlocked front door and found Derek and Megan sitting in the dark, suffocating living room, miserably drinking cheap wine and ignoring the towering stack of final eviction notices resting on the coffee table. Leo slammed the printed documents down onto the glass table right in front of them. He demanded to know the truth. He demanded to know why the grandfather they claimed was a destitute, wandering vagrant was currently featured on the front page of a global financial publication as a reclusive billionaire. Megan, slightly intoxicated and completely exhausted from years of running from her massive debt, picked up the paper with a trembling hand. She read the bold headline. She looked closely at the photograph. The cheap wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering violently against the hardwood floor. Derek leaned over his eyes, scanning the impossible numbers listed in the article, the billions of dollars in active global assets, the massive fortress estate in Montana. The sheer, unadulterated terror washed over their faces as the catastrophic reality of their situation finally crystallized in their minds. They suddenly realized they had not outsmarted a vulnerable, grieving widower 15 years ago. They had maliciously crossed a man possessing an incredibly lethal, calculating intellect. They realized that the toxic house in Seattle, the devastating zoning lawsuits, and their entire decade of absolute financial ruin had not been a string of terrible luck. It had been a meticulously engineered punishment. For a brief, agonizing moment, the room was completely silent as the heavy weight of their monumental stupidity crushed the last remaining breath from their lungs. But terror is a fleeting emotion for the truly greedy. Within seconds, the paralyzing fear was violently overridden by a desperate, sickening wave of entitlement. Megan stood up, her eyes wide and frantic. She did not feel remorse for the 15 years of silence. She did not feel shame for throwing me to the wolves. All she saw was a massive golden lifeline dangling just out of reach. She looked at Derek and began speaking with a manic, hyperactive intensity. She claimed that I was his father, that they were my only immediate family, and that they had a legal and moral right to that unbelievable fortune. Derek, perpetually weak and entirely desperate for a way out of his suffocating poverty, instantly agreed with her delusional logic. They convinced themselves that if they could just see me face to face, if they could just play the role of the apologetic, desperate children, I would easily fold. They believed my old paternal instincts would immediately override a decade and a half of silent exile. They completely ignored Leo, who was staring at them with absolute unmasked disgust, realizing for the first time the true rotten nature of his own parents. Megan and Derek frantically rushed through the dying house, grabbing whatever small valuables they had left to pawn. They sold Megan's last remaining piece of jewelry and drained the absolute final cents from their overdrafted checking accounts, just to purchase 3 expensive commercial airline tickets. They did not waste a single second. Driven by a volatile cocktail of absolute terror and ravenous greed, my son and his wife liquidated the very last of their meager possessions to buy 3 commercial airline tickets to Montana. I knew they were coming long before their rented car ever reached the base of my mountain. The advanced perimeter surveillance grid surrounding my estate pinged my private security team the moment an unauthorized vehicle turned onto the private miles-long access road. I sat comfortably behind the massive mahogany desk in my study, watching their progress on a high-definition security monitor. It was poetic to watch them approach the fortress they had unknowingly funded through their own malicious betrayal. The winding mountain road was steep and intentionally intimidating, flanked by dense, towering pine trees that blocked out the rest of the world. When their rented sedan finally reached the primary security checkpoint, the sheer architectural dominance of the Caldwell estate loomed over them. The imposing gates were constructed from solid, reinforced steel rising 20 feet into the freezing mountain air. 2 former military contractors dressed in tactical winter gear and openly carrying sidearms stepped out of the heated guardhouse to intercept the vehicle. I watched through the camera feed as Derek rolled down the driver's side window, his face pale and visibly trembling. He likely expected to find a frail old man living in a modest cabin. Instead, he was met by armed guards demanding strict identification before granting access to a multi-billion-dollar compound. The heavy steel gates slowly swung open, groaning with a deep mechanical resonance that echoed across the quiet valley. The security detail did not simply let them drive up to the front door. 2 black, heavily armored sport utility vehicles escorted their cheap rental car up the winding, 3-mile-long driveway. As they drove higher into the compound, the true staggering scale of my wealth finally revealed itself. The main residence was a hyper-modern marvel of glass-imported stone and dark timber seamlessly integrated into the rugged cliffside. It was a physical manifestation of absolute power and total isolation. For Megan, a woman who had spent the last 15 years desperately trying to project an illusion of high society wealth in a dusty desert subdivision, the sight of my estate must have been absolutely soul-crushing. Her entire fabricated identity, her desperate clinging to leased luxury cars and fake country club friends was instantly dwarfed by the quiet, terrifying reality of genuine, untouchable billions. Her massive ego was methodically dismantled before she even stepped out of the car. My grandson Leo sat quietly in the back seat, staring up at the architectural marvel with the appreciative eyes of an aspiring engineer, completely disgusted by the frantic, greedy whispering of his parents in the front seats. When the vehicles finally stopped in the expansive, circular courtyard, my head of security, a towering man named Marcus, personally opened the door for them. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply instructed them to follow him inside. They were led through the massive custom-built double front doors and into the grand foyer of the main house. I had designed the interior to reflect absolute strength. There were no flashy, ostentatious decorations, no gaudy chandeliers or desperate displays of newly acquired wealth. The floors were polished slate. The walls were clad in rich, dark walnut. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered an uninterrupted, breathtaking view of the snow-capped mountain range. The sheer scale of the house was intentionally designed to make anyone who entered feel incredibly small. Every single footstep they took echoed against the hard stone, a constant reminder that they were stepping into a domain where they possessed absolutely no power. Marcus guided them down a long, dimly lit corridor that led directly to my private study. As they approached, the heavy mahogany doors were slowly pushed open. I was sitting perfectly still behind my vast desk, bathed in the soft, natural light filtering through the large windows behind me. I wore a simple, tailored, dark suit. I did not stand up to greet them. I did not offer a warm, paternal smile. I simply sat there calmly sipping a cup of hot Earl Grey tea from a delicate porcelain saucer. The exact same brand of tea Sarah used to brew for me on rainy afternoons in Seattle. The contrast between us was striking and absolute. I had aged, my hair was snow white, but my posture was rigid, and my presence filled the massive room. Derek and Megan, however, looked entirely broken. The 15 years of stress, the crushing lawsuits, the predatory loans, and the heavy alcohol abuse had completely ravaged them. Derek looked haggard, his shoulders slumped, his eyes darting around the room with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. Megan's face was deeply lined, her previous arrogant smirk replaced by an expression of desperate, naked panic. Leo stood a few steps behind them, his jaw clenched tight, observing the scene with a quiet, respectful distance. Our eyes met for a brief fraction of a second, and I gave him a nearly imperceptible nod. I understood exactly what was happening. For a long, agonizing minute, the room was completely silent. The only sound was the faint ticking of an antique grandfather clock standing in the corner. I placed my teacup down on the wooden desk with a soft, deliberate click. The sharp noise seemed to break the invisible dam holding them back. Megan was the first to break. She threw herself forward dramatically, clutching the edge of my desk, and burst into a fit of violent theatrical tears. The sobbing was entirely manufactured, a pathetic, rehearsed performance designed specifically to manipulate the soft heart of a grieving father she thought still existed. "Harrison," she wailed, her voice cracking with artificial sorrow. "We are so incredibly sorry. You have absolutely no idea the absolute hell we have been through. We made a terrible mistake." Derek immediately followed her cue. The son I had raised, the boy I had taught to stand tall and face his failures with honor, literally collapsed onto his knees on the expensive Persian rug. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with exaggerated sobs. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice muffled and pathetic. "You have to forgive us. We were so young and stupid. That money, that awful situation in Seattle, it completely corrupted us. We were blinded by the pressure. We tried to find you. We swear we tried to look for you for years, but you just vanished. We never wanted to hurt you. We just want our family back. Please, Dad, look at us. We have nothing left. We just want our father back." They wove a tapestry of absolutely disgusting lies right in front of my face. They claimed they had spent years desperately searching for me, completely ignoring the fact that they were the ones who had coldly instructed me to figure it out while they drove away with my stolen life savings. They blamed their unimaginable cruelty on youth and the corrupting influence of sudden wealth, conveniently forgetting that they were full-grown adults when they methodically planned my ruin in the dark kitchen of my own home. Derek knelt there on the floor, weeping like a beaten child, begging for a paternal mercy he had mercilessly denied me 15 years prior. Megan continued to sob violently, her tears smudging her makeup, reaching her hands across the desk in a desperate attempt to grasp mine. I did not pull away. I did not flinch. I simply leaned back in my heavy leather chair, steepled my fingers together beneath my chin, and looked at them with an expression of absolute chilling indifference. I did not raise my voice to shout over their pathetic wailing. I did not angrily list their crimes or demand an explanation for their sociopathic betrayal. I simply let them perform their desperate, miserable play in a thick, suffocating silence. I let the vast, quiet power of the room slowly absorb their lies. The longer I remained completely silent, the more frantic their apologies became. Their words began to trip over one another, their excuses becoming increasingly nonsensical as the terrifying realization slowly dawned on them. They were not speaking to a vulnerable father who could be easily swayed by fake tears. They were speaking to a stone wall. The silence stretched out heavy and lethal, pressing down on their lungs until their fabricated sobs finally choked and completely died in their throats. Derek remained kneeling on the expensive Persian rug, his hands slowly slipping down from his face to reveal an expression of profound confusion. They had come to Montana expecting to manipulate a vulnerable old man who was desperate for familial connection. Instead, they found a fortress and a man who had not felt paternal warmth for them in over a decade. I took one final slow sip of my hot tea, enjoying the quiet comfort of the familiar flavor. I placed the delicate porcelain cup down on its matching saucer with a deliberate click. That small sound echoed like a gunshot in the tense, freezing atmosphere of the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell, scream, or express any of the chaotic anger they likely anticipated. Anger is an emotion reserved for people who feel wronged or out of control. I felt entirely in control. I slowly reached down to the bottom drawer of my massive desk. The metallic slide of the drawer opening drew their frantic eyes like magnets. I reached inside and retrieved a small flat object. I placed it gently on the polished wooden surface of my desk. It was a custom-made thick glass display case sealed tightly around the edges with dark metal framing. Inside the clear glass rested three very specific items: a highly crumpled $100 bill, a similarly worn $50 bill, and a faded yellow sticky note with hastily scribbled ink. I placed my fingertips on the cool glass and slowly slid the heavy case across the wide expanse of the desk. The glass made a low, grinding friction sound against the wood until it came to a stop directly in front of Megan's trembling hands. I instructed her to look at it. She hesitated, her eyes darting nervously toward Derek, before she slowly lowered her gaze to the glass case. It took her brain exactly 3 seconds to process what she was looking at. I watched the blood instantly drain from her face. Her jaw went completely slack. Derek slowly pulled himself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the edge of the desk to look at the encased items. He let out a sharp, choked gasp. Those were the exact bills they had left on the bare kitchen island 15 years ago. That was the exact note Megan had written when they stripped my house bare, stole my life savings, and abandoned me to die. "You stood in my kitchen and handed me a death sentence," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. "You took every single dollar I had painstakingly saved with my late wife. You stripped the furniture from the rooms where I raised my family. You looked at a grieving, broken 62-year-old man and decided his life was entirely worthless. And then you left me this exact note. You told me to figure it out." I leaned slightly forward, resting my forearms on the desk, locking my eyes directly onto my son's terrified face. "I figured it out, Derek," I stated plainly, letting the profound weight of my words crush the air out of the room. "I figured it out exceptionally well. But clearly, looking at the two of you standing here wearing unwashed clothes and stinking of cheap airplane gin, you did not. You thought you were incredibly brilliant. You thought you had orchestrated the flawless crime against a senile old fool." Megan tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, but her vocal cords completely refused to function. Derek shook his head in a rapid, jerky motion, violently denying the reality rapidly closing in on him. Dad, please, he whispered, his voice cracking with pure terror. We did not know. We did not understand what we were doing. I raised my hand, a sharp gesture that instantly silenced his pathetic whining. I was not finished. I reached back into my desk and pulled out a massive, bright red legal binder. It was the exact same Richard Gallagher had handed me all those years ago. I dropped it onto the desk with a heavy slam that made both of them physically flinch. I told you that my mind is engineered to understand structural failure, I explained methodically. I understand exactly how things break, and I understand exactly how people break. I knew about your cowardly plan days before you even finalized the sale of my house. I stood in the dark hallway and listened to you plot my absolute ruin in the kitchen. I could have stopped the sale. I could have easily filed an emergency injunction and frozen your escrow accounts before you ever crossed the state line. Derek stared at me, his eyes wide with a horrified, dawning comprehension. Then why did you not? He choked out, his voice laced with profound dread. Because I needed you to steal that house, I answered, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. That Seattle property was a catastrophic financial time bomb. The land it was built on was deeply contaminated by an undocumented industrial dumping site. The city was quietly preparing a massive environmental zoning lawsuit and millions in retroactive cleanup tax liens. If I had sold that house myself, I would have been legally obligated to disclose that toxic hazard or faced a lifetime of brutal fraud litigation from the furious buyers. But you two were blindingly, spectacularly greedy. I continued, watching the absolute horror paralyze their features. You forced me to sign that comprehensive power of attorney. You legally removed my name from the final closing documents and eagerly signed your own names under the strict penalty of perjury. By stealing my house, you legally assumed every single ounce of that impending toxic liability. You shielded me from the fallout, and you willingly handcuffed yourselves to a sinking ship. I did not destroy your lives in Arizona. I simply stepped out of the way and allowed your own monumental greed to consume you completely. You bankrupted yourselves because you were too arrogant to look beneath the floorboards of the kingdom you stole. Megan turned as white as a sheet of fresh paper. The deep bags under her eyes seemed to hollow out entirely. She physically stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized the true horrifying scale of my retaliation. Derek recoiled sharply, stumbling away from the desk, as if the red binder had physically burned him. His breathing became rapid and shallow, a full-blown panic attack, taking hold of his fragile nervous system. They finally understood. The terrifying, undeniable truth washed over them in a suffocating wave. They realized they had never been the clever, ruthless hunters they believed themselves to be. They had been the blind, foolish prey for 15 entire years, and the trap had worked flawlessly. The crushing weight of their realization hung in the air for a fleeting moment before the toxic reflex of human greed took over. I watched the profound terror in Derek's eyes morph into something entirely different. It was a desperate, feral sense of entitlement. My son pushed himself off the edge of the mahogany desk, standing up to his full height, in a pathetic attempt to reclaim authority. His chest heaved as he pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. He did not apologize for the 15 years of agonizing silence. He did not express an ounce of genuine remorse for leaving me in an empty, doomed house. Instead, he chose to weaponize the biological connection he had ruthlessly discarded. "Dad, you cannot possibly do this to us," Derek shouted, his voice echoing against the bookshelves. "You are a billionaire. We just read the entire article. You have a massive global empire, and I am your only living child. I am your direct bloodline. Regardless of what happened in the past, I have a fundamental right to my inheritance. You owe me a portion of this estate. We are practically homeless because of that real estate disaster, and you are hoarding an unimaginable fortune. You have to give us our rightful share." Megan rallied behind his delusional outburst. Her panic vanished, replaced by aggressive hostility. She slammed her hands flat against my desk, leaning forward with her teeth bared. He is your son, Harrison. She hissed, her voice dripping with a sickening blend of anger and desperation. You cannot hide in the mountains and cut your only family out of a multi-billion-dollar fortune. We will hire a lawyer. We will contest any document you have. We will drag you through the courts. You have to write us a check today to settle this. I did not blink. I did not shift my posture in the heavy leather chair. I simply looked at the two of them, absolutely marveling at the sheer, unadulterated audacity of their demands. They were standing in my fortress, surrounded by the physical manifestation of my genius, aggressively demanding a reward for their own catastrophic failure. They truly believed that the legal system they had once used to steal my modest suburban home could now be effectively weaponized to plunder my global empire. They were profoundly mistaken. I calmly reached beneath the edge of my desk and pressed a hidden button. Less than 10 seconds, the mahogany doors of the study swung open with a smooth glide. Richard Gallagher walked into the room. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, his silver hair neatly combed, holding a sleek black leather portfolio under his arm. Richard possessed the cold, calculating presence of a corporate executioner. He walked with measured, deliberate steps until he stood beside my chair, looking down at Derek and Megan with an expression of professional disgust. Derek took a hesitant step backward, his false bravado instantly faltering under Richard's intense gaze. "Who are you?" Derek demanded, his voice dropping an octave in sudden intimidation. "My name is Richard Gallagher," he replied smoothly, commanding absolute authority in the quiet room. "I am the primary legal counsel and the chief executive trustee for Caldwell Engineering and all associated holding companies. Your father asked me to join this meeting to clarify a few significant misunderstandings you seem to have regarding your perceived financial entitlements." Richard calmly opened the black leather portfolio and extracted a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. He placed them deliberately on the desk right next to the glass case holding the crumpled $150. "You just threatened to hire an attorney to contest your father's estate." Richard began addressing Megan with a polite smile. "I feel it is my professional duty to inform you that you would be thoroughly wasting whatever pocket change you have left. You see, Harrison Caldwell does not actually own a single fraction of this massive empire. He does not own this mountain estate. He does not own the patents. He does not even technically own the tea he is currently drinking." Derek frowned, genuine confusion warring with his blinding greed. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. "The magazine article explicitly stated he is a billionaire. The magazine article accurately detailed the total market value of the assets he created." Richard clarified smoothly. "However, 15 years ago, on the exact day you abandoned him in Seattle, your father officially transferred 100% of his intellectual property, his liquid capital, and all future corporate royalties into a highly secure, irrevocable charitable trust. Do you understand the specific legal definition of the word irrevocable, Derek? It means the transfer is absolute, permanent, and completely unalterable. The assets belong exclusively to the trust, which is legally bound to fund global infrastructure grants. Your father acts as a salaried director. He has completely stripped himself of personal taxable ownership. Therefore, there is absolutely no personal estate for you to contest." The color drained from Megan's face once again. She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning bone white as the horrific reality of the legal structure finally registered in her mind. "But he is still our family," she whispered desperately. "There has to be a provision for his direct heirs." Richard slowly turned the page of the heavy legal document, his finger tracing a very specific highlighted paragraph near the bottom of the sheet. "I am incredibly glad you brought that up," Richard stated, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. Richard cleared his throat and began to read aloud, his voice steady and perfectly clear, ensuring every single syllable hit them with maximum devastating impact. Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the Foundational Trust Charter. "Let it be explicitly known and legally recorded that I, Harrison Caldwell, consciously, deliberately, and permanently disinherit my biological son, Derek Caldwell, and his wife, Megan Caldwell. They shall receive absolutely no financial compensation, no material assets, and no corporate authority from this trust now or at any point following my natural death. Furthermore, should they attempt to legally contest this specific directive, the trust is formally authorized to financially ruin them. Richard finished reading and slowly closed the black portfolio. He looked directly into Derek's wide, tear-filled eyes. "You get absolutely nothing," Richard finalized, delivering the ultimate death blow to their delusional greed. "You receive $0. You receive zero assets. You are permanently legally severed from the Caldwell name and fortune. The documents are airtight, aggressively verified by top corporate judges, and entirely bulletproof. You could hire 1,000 lawyers and find nothing." Derek let out a pathetic gasp. His legs gave out completely, and he collapsed onto the Persian rug, burying his head in his trembling hands. The sheer magnitude of his absolute failure crushed him. He had sacrificed his relationship with a loving father. He had actively participated in a cruel theft, and he had spent the last 15 years running from a toxic lawsuit, all for a fleeting illusion. Megan stood entirely frozen, completely unable to process the absolute finality of the legal guillotine that had just severed their heads. The oppressive silence in my mahogany study stretched out like a physical weight. Derek remained crumpled against the expensive Persian rug, his fabricated reality entirely destroyed by the unforgiving legal truths Richard had just presented. Megan simply stared blankly at the dark leather portfolio, her mind finally fracturing under the realization that there were absolutely no loopholes left to exploit. There were no more manipulative tears to shed, no more lies to spin, and no more predatory angles to pursue. I let them sit in that humiliating absolute defeat for a long, agonizing moment, allowing the profound finality of their ruin to deeply penetrate their greedy minds. Then I slowly shifted my gaze away from the pathetic wreckage of my son and his wife, turning my attention entirely toward the third person in the room. My grandson Leo was standing near the towering bookshelves, deliberately maintaining a wide, respectful distance from the emotional collapse of his parents. He was not crying. He was not acting out in a frantic panic. Instead, he looked down at his mother and father with an expression of profound, unmasked disgust. Watching the rigid, stoic posture of his shoulders and the sharp analytical focus in his eyes, I saw absolutely none of Derek in him. I saw only the resilient, unbroken spirit of my own bloodline. I raised my right hand slightly, gesturing for the young man to step forward. Leo hesitated for just a fraction of a second, his eyes darting briefly toward his softly weeping father, before he squared his broad shoulders and walked directly up to my desk. He stood tall, projecting a quiet, undeniable strength that completely defied the toxic, chaotic environment he had been forced to endure for the past 15 years. I looked at the young engineering student, feeling a genuine, powerful surge of paternal pride that I had not experienced in over a decade. "Leo," I began, my voice softening considerably from the lethal cold tone I had just used to dismantle his parents. "You have spent your entire young life paying for the monumental sins of these two people. You grew up inside a fragile house built entirely on stolen money and desperate lies. When their pathetic illusion inevitably collapsed, they selfishly allowed the crushing weight of their financial ruin to fall squarely onto your shoulders. They forced you to take on massive, crippling student loans to fund your education, while they desperately clung to a dying, superficial facade." Leo nodded slowly, his jaw clenching tight as he processed the undeniable truth of my words. I reached into the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a crisp, sealed white envelope. I placed it gently on the polished wood right next to the glass display case holding the crumpled $150. "I want you to know the absolute truth about your university scholarship." I continued, watching his intelligent eyes widen slightly in sudden anticipation. "There was no anonymous philanthropic foundation that miraculously discovered your academic transcripts. I am the sole exclusive benefactor of that blind educational trust. I personally paid off every single cent of your predatory student loans. I fully funded your engineering tuition, your laboratory fees, and your monthly living stipend. I did it completely anonymously, because I absolutely refused to let your greedy parents touch a single dime of my money. But I also refused to let their cowardly monumental failures destroy your brilliant potential. Derek suddenly lifted his tear-stained face from the carpet, gasping audibly at this new revelation. A sickening, desperate spark of hope flashed in his eyes, a delusional thought that he could somehow access my wealth through his son. Megan let out a weak whimper, realizing that I had been secretly protecting and elevating their child, while simultaneously engineering their absolute destruction. They had been entirely outmaneuvered on every single conceivable front. I slid the crisp white envelope across the desk until it rested directly in front of Leo. Inside that envelope is a comprehensive elite employment contract, I stated plainly, my voice echoing with absolute authority. It is a guaranteed permanent position at Caldwell Engineering, starting the exact moment you graduate. You will be placed directly into the Advanced Structural Design Division. You will receive a top-tier executive salary, full corporate benefits, and direct daily mentorship from the finest engineering minds in the entire world. I am offering you the keys to a multi-billion-dollar global empire. I am offering you the profound legacy your father was too incredibly weak and corrupt to inherit. Leo stared down at the white envelope. His breathing was remarkably steady, his sharp mind clearly analyzing the monumental weight of the offer resting before him. However, I added my tone, turning deadly serious once more, chilling the air between us. There is one absolute, non-negotiable condition attached to this contract. This specific legacy is meant exclusively and permanently for you. But to walk through my corporate doors, you must walk entirely alone. You must permanently leave their toxicity behind. If you accept this incredible offer, you will completely sever your financial, professional, and personal ties to them. I will not allow their parasitic greed to infect the clean, solid foundation we are going to build together. You must make your choice right now. The tension in the room was absolute. Derek reached out a trembling hand toward his son, whispering a desperate plea. But Leo did not even look back at his parents. He did not ask for their permission, nor did he seek their worthless guidance. He reached out with a steady, confident hand, picked up the white envelope, and firmly placed it inside his jacket pocket. He looked me directly in the eyes and offered a sharp, definitive nod. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable gravity of a man making the most important decision of his entire life. He purposefully stepped around the heavy desk and stood firmly by my side, physically and emotionally, separating himself from the rotting wreckage on the floor. The transition was absolutely complete. The diseased branches of my family tree had been violently pruned, and the healthy, strong roots were finally secured. I looked back down at Derek and Megan. They were completely broken, stripped of their stolen money, their foreclosed home, their pathetic social status, and now their only son. They had nothing left to leverage. I pressed a small silver button on my desk. Marcus, my towering head of security, instantly stepped into the study, accompanied by two heavily armed guards. "Escort these two individuals off my property immediately," I commanded coldly. "Do not allow them to take anything other than the clothes they are currently wearing. If they ever attempt to approach these gates again, you have my full, unconditional authorization to have them arrested for aggressive criminal trespassing." Marcus stepped forward with intimidating speed. He grabbed Derek by the shoulder and hauled him roughly to his feet. Megan was dragged from her chair, her legs too weak to support her trembling body. They did not scream. They did not try to fight back. They were entirely hollowed out, utterly defeated by the flawless architecture of their own spectacular ruin. I stood up from my leather chair and walked over to the massive window overlooking the sprawling, snow-covered mountain valley. Leo stood silently right beside me. Together we watched as the highly trained security team marched them out of the grand foyer and into the freezing mountain air. They were not provided with a warm vehicle, so they were forced to walk. We stood in the quiet warmth of the study, watching their small, pathetic figures trudge down the winding 3-mile-long driveway. They were marching toward a brutal, unforgiving reality where they possessed no money, no home, and no one left to manipulate. The bitterly cold winter wind whipped around them as they disappeared into the dense pine forest. I looked down at the glass case on my desk, staring at the old bills and the faded note. I felt an overwhelming, incredibly peaceful wave of chilling closure wash over my soul. The crushing debt of exactly $150 had finally been paid in full. Greed is a deadly venom that slowly devours the fragile vessel carrying it. When you betray the people who loved you, fed you, and fully trusted you, you do not just destroy their lives. You actively sign the strict warrant for your own ultimate destruction. True wealth is not found in stolen bank accounts, manipulated documents, or the pathetic illusion of high society status. It is forged in patience, integrity, and the quiet resilience of a mind refusing to be broken. If you treat family like disposable collateral, do not be surprised when the universe eventually demands its brutal repayment. Have you ever experienced a severe betrayal from someone you trusted with your entire life? How did you manage to rise from the ashes and rebuild? Share your personal story in the comments section below. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories.